So this is my reading, commentary, and reflection on the Platonic dialogue Parmenides. And so I like starting a new chapter, a new episode, whatever you want to call it, because I could slowly build back up to where we were. And obviously this is part 12. 11 previous parts, each were roughly 2 hours, maybe a little bit longer, so there's a lot of material that we've covered already. So it's really not a practical thing to go over all of it again. It sort of reemerges slowly as the context builds. So I wanted to start with a prayer. Sometimes I do this, sometimes I don't. I used to do it more frequently. I tend often to keep it more private than record the prayer, but no one's probably going to ever listen to this, so it's fine. So, dear Lord, I thank you for this day, and I thank you that I can be here. Lord, despite my shortcomings, in my lack of foresight and my lack of capacity to see and to synthesize information, and perhaps to maintain all of the information that you provide me, such that I can listen to your direction. I am thankful for what I have been able to interpret from your grace. And I pray that of mind that I am able to accept the sacrifices for goodness, to give up those parts of myself for which I know or perhaps don't know but ought to pay attention to, that limit me and hold me back. And I'm thankful for those in my life that are close to me and I have an intimate connection with. And I pray that this experience is something that moves me closer to you. And with this I pray in Jesus' name, amen. So I'm not exactly sure where to start this. I sort of finished right in the middle of a paragraph. But I'm just going to drop the ball somewhere and see where it goes. So I want to start with Parmenides' statement here. He says, so the things not one could not be a number either, for in that case, two, they would not be absolutely not one, since they would at least have number. Yes, you're quite right, says Aristotle. And again, are the things not one parts of the one? Or would the things not one in that case two partake of the one? They would, says Aristotle. So let's go back to that first sentence and try to break this down. So the things not one could not be a number either. So we've been having this discussion about multiplicity, the one, which as an identity is composed of two primary parts, being and oneness. I've been using a term called the bridge of coherence to connect them together. This connection is the thing that produces the identity of the one. Often in things that we observe, that we participate with in ourselves, this oneness in being is inseparable. And yet we have these concepts of difference and of multiplicity. We've been spending some time discussing the relevance of attention and how perspective matters. And in some sense, it's quite easy to get lost in this not one language. But so far I've been defining not one as sort of like an experience, where it's a liminal, or perhaps transitory, experience, such that multiplicity exists, this plurality of things exist, and while we can say within the multiplicity, within the plurality, we take one of the things in there, we could say that that thing is one. But when we take the bigger picture, which has this sort of loose border around it with chaotic elements that are not integrated into one thing, we called this experience not one. Now, this is the only way that I've been able to hold this in a stable manner in my mind. Perhaps there's other ways of doing it, but so far this is where I'm at. Now, the issue that arises here is in some sense linguistic, because Parmenides says, so the thing's not one. And this seems to imply a certain locality. And there's a danger here, because if there's a locality, then it's hard to imagine that this is something that is not an identity. If it's something that's not an identity, then it's not anything. It's not being. So if we have something, it is. And so therefore it participates in being, and it participates in oneness. Now, if we are to interpret this based on the not one scenario, whereas this not one, by profound differentiation, is encapsulated on the margins because it's so different from everything else and so disunified that it has to have this sort of category of not one. If we stay there, and we imagine maybe multiples of these things, then it's easier to justify. So the thing's not one could not be a number either. For in that case, 2, they would not be absolutely not one. Or rather, I should say, for in that case, 2, they would not be absolutely not one. Hopefully I said that right the first time. But if something has number, of course it's 1. Or if it's 2, whatever, it still has oneness within it. But if we go back to our not one scenario, we have that thing being defined by incoherence. Still, it would be difficult because it would have number. The thing that we're speaking about with the margins would be 1. And again, says Parmenides, are the things not one parts of the one? Or would the things not one in that case 2 partake of the one? Now this is where there's a subtle turn, there's a change. So when Aristotle says that they would partake of the one, it's interesting because now we have some sort of precondition that is established. We are saying that that which is not one participates in the one, and there's oneness involved there, at least. And this is consistent with what we were saying, that it has to be this way, because even though we're describing a liminal state, the thing, not one, is still describing something that can be at least loosely defined as one thing. It participates in oneness, and it has the ground of being. Anything that is has that ground of being in order for it to be. Parmenides continues and he says, so if it is in every way one, and they are in every way not one, the one would be neither a part of the things not one, nor a whole with them as parts. So it gets a little confusing here. So if it is in every way one, and they are in every way not one, the one would be neither a part of the things not one, nor a whole with them as parts. Okay, so let's consider this. Now, taking the first, if they are in every way not one, the one would not be a part of it. And this is something that we've established earlier. The one is this type of base experience. And we've been thinking about this in two ways. We've been thinking about the one as an identity in and of itself, and we've been thinking about the one as its behavior unfolds, or its purpose is realized, let's say. And its purpose is realized by maintaining the coherence of oneness and being. And the coherence of oneness and being is found in all things. So the difficulty is squaring the one with this, like we said, this liminal state of not one. And I think we have to a degree, because not one is only a placeholder. Liminal, again. But still, it is something that outlines and defines something that is, something that participates in the coherence between oneness and being. And so while the things themselves within not one, they are not the one, but they do utilize, they do participate in the substrate that it offers. So again, if it is in every way one, and they are in every way not one, then one would be neither a part of the things not one, nor a whole with them as parts. Yeah, both of these don't match, because if we had the things within the one as parts of the one, it would change its identity quite substantially. On the converse side, if the one was just a part of the things, then I think that its identity would be unstable. It has to be the ground by which the thing itself is born. Its very articulation and instantiation depends on the coherence between oneness and being. If that fact was not a stable reality, then everything else would cease to be. It would dissociate into difference such that oneness would dissolve, and if that's the case, then being would dissolve. He continues and he says, and in turn, the things not one would be neither parts of the one nor wholes in relation to the one as part. So let's take a moment and go through again what is likely meant by the things not one. Now we have two potentials that I've been using. One is that we have this unconsolidated experience of being. And for whatever reason, it has been outlined that this particular section of being, again, whether it be temporary or otherwise, has an unstable unity, and so we call this thing not one. Then on the other hand, well, maybe there's three things. On the other hand, we can think about this hypothetical in which there is this casual boundary describing a chaotic environment of this expression of being. And we can think about the individual elements that make up this experience. They themselves, of course, being things, have oneness. It's not as though something is something, and yet is not a thing. And we could scale this at any level. I've been using the analogy as a sort of in cosmology, I'm thinking about a gas cloud, a gigantic gas cloud. But it can, I think, refer to something that is quite small, in which there is significant disorganization. And the reason I've been using the word disorganization is because there's an inherent implication that because of the disorder, that it is not given to congregation and to oneness. And since it is not disposed to such a thing, we at least so far, we get that not in the not one. The one business is always difficult because of our perception of how things participate and relate to it. The things not one would be neither parts of the one nor wholes in relation to the one as parts. So another way in which we can describe this not one is more of a literal approach, in which there is a possibility for which there can be something and yet have it not participate in oneness. I don't think that's possible. And I suppose there's somewhat of a similarity. We touched on this before, that it has to do with the one as an identity rather than oneness as the principle. And now this not one situation would make sense if we would say that the thing that is in this category is not a part of the one. He says the thing is not one would be neither parts of the one. So we are saying it's not, in this situation, a part of that experience by which the center point of coherence facilitates the union of oneness and being and its expression into all things. Or rather, all things that are expressed from those principles. Nor wholes in relation to the one as part. Now, this last statement is a tough one to visualize. The things not one would be neither parts of the one nor wholes in relation to the one as parts. So we have to remember we're considering the things that are not one. Again, there's a few variations by which we can conceive of that. But we shouldn't let that lack of a firmly stable definition limit us here, because I think it's meant to be a bit dynamic. Now he's saying, nor wholes in relation. So, out of all of this talk that we've had about the vertical, about perspective, and the relative angular expression of things, of articulate things, I think it's all very relevant here. Nor wholes in relation to the one, as part. Now this is where it's confusing. On one hand, it's confusing because what wholes are we speaking about here? We are saying that it's not the fact that, let's say, we use our traditional definition. We say that there are things within this not one experience. We could take one of those, this chaotic thing that's involved in something poorly localized from a stability standpoint. We dive into that thing and we ask ourselves, is there the one here? Now the answer, of course, is no, based on what Parmenides is suggesting. But at least we have to explore the implication. We are forced to reconcile with a couple of things. The identity of one as such, and this thing that is, that we are saying is not one. Or maybe perhaps is participating in something that is not one. So in the first instance, we have to say that the one as an identity and the one's influence is different, is separate rather. Different, I think, is fine. We've been over this a few times. But let's try to give it a little bit more firm, direct language. Why is it important to make the distinction between the identity of something and the purpose or the effect that something has? Now, let's take, since I'm looking straight ahead, let's take my floor lamp as an example. The floor lamp has an identity. There are properties and qualities that are associated with it, such that the thing that it is instantiated. Now, when I see the floor lamp, I see the different qualities. I think that there is a difference between this experience and that experience for which, when I get home and it is dark and I need to turn on a light, the purpose of the lamp is related to its identity, surely. But it's hard not to see the difference that lies between the two, and that the effect that the light has on everything else is almost independent of its identity. It doesn't matter what the shape of the lamp is, or the aesthetics of the lamp. What matters is that it has the capacity to emit light. In one sense, we could say, well, this is the most fundamental thing about the lamp, is that it has this capacity. And just like in terms of the one, its most fundamental thing is establishing that coherence between oneness and being. And yet, the light, in the case of the lamp, or articulate things, in the case of oneness and being, are all illuminated by that expression of that which it is. And so maybe I should rather say, instead of it being separate, I should think of the identity and then the identity's expression. And of course, any sort of expression might have any number of second order to third order effects. The very fact that I can see and now manipulate my environment in a way that is better than I could before is something that I will carry on doing independent of my lamp, the consideration of my lamp, let's say. And so we can have something that participates in the expression of the one, and yet is not consumed by the identity of it. So, I'm taking another object here. I'm looking at the painting that is above the lamp. Sort of a nice place for it because the lamp illuminates it. Now this painting is a separate identity from the lamp. Its product, or its expression, is influenced by the expression of the lamp's identity, or the lamp's purpose or capacity. But the two remain separate. And also, I think it's worth mentioning that this is occurring at a particular level. That one isn't necessarily the ground of the other, as it is in the case of oneness and being. Now, identity is sameness maintained through some variation. We have to imagine that in our not one situation, we have such a degree of variation that this sameness has difficulty maintaining itself. So there's this constant shifting in identity. The liminality, I think, is something that continues to be prudent as an observation. Now, it would be incorrect to say that of these things, constantly changing, their center point of coherence is always shifting, is not to say that the one is apart. I think even for things that we would say that are outside of this not one situation, like the lamp or the painting, these are quite static things, fairly stable identities. They're not going to change anytime soon. it still, I don't think, would make any sense to say that the one is part of those things. The part and whole situation there sort of breaks down, I think, to a degree. It would be like saying that because the lamp has some influence over the painting, then the lamp is part of the painting. That doesn't really make any sense. I can see the painting because of the expression of the lamp's identity. Likewise, the painting is because of the one's expression. Coherence of oneness, which the painting is, and being, which the painting is. So today happens to be a new day. A new day brings new thoughts. And I'm a bit conflicted today. It's a Friday evening. I've tried to enjoy it the best I can. I wish I could have been more productive and gotten to this microphone sooner. And I think that that's where a lot of the conflict arises. And what I find interesting, at least about my experience and about my mind, is that while all of us are capable of doing things that fulfill us, the essential thing, one of the principled things, is that if we want something good, we're going to have to give a good effort for it. And of course, life is full of accidents. There are things that come to us maybe that we didn't expect, we didn't deserve, or perhaps we did. But of that which we can influence, that which we can direct, I want to avoid saying the word control, but to the small elements that we may direct, and by extension, say that we in some way control. It never surprises me that even within the confines through which we exist, exert themselves, meaning that our finite experience, I don't want to say simplicity in nature, that is not the correct term, but of a sort of a relation to the simple, meaning restricted to a certain level, I suppose, not aware of that which could be. We value ourselves highly. Perhaps I value myself too highly, in the sense that I consider where the self may go, what the self may be. And it's, on one hand, it's a sort of irony, it's a kind of a joke to put it in these terms. It's almost sort of a self-ashamedness that comes from it. Because it's almost seeming to suggest that because one values the self, they wish to exalt themselves highly. And perhaps there's an element of it there. Perhaps it's not just. I'm not sure. But the core of the point, I think, can be extracted in a bit more of a pure manner. That of the averages and above the curve and below the curve, we find opinions about these sorts of things, about where the self finds itself, about where a collective finds itself, about how these change and manifest throughout the ages. I think it less becomes a question of the self, though it still involves the self, and more of something that is right, I suppose, but also correct. And that the standard is not just something that somebody produces to exalt the self. It is a standard by which somebody adheres to expand the experience of that self. And there's more that needs to be said there, because it could still expand into something that is narcissistic and just as self-absorbed as a simple sociopath or whatever. The expanded self is able to accept more and give more. It is able to understand when to open its gates, when to deflate, when to inflate, when to defend, when to accept defeat. One that understands goodness through multiplicity and through diversity. That values that strong center place, but also understands that if there are forces beyond that are creating a chaotic environment, that it's not all for naught. It's not something to reduce us into a disbelieving disposition. And I think all of the passivity, the addiction, the ease by which the mind willingly accepts a passive experience, a sedated experience, is, in some sense, the degree to which it has lost value for itself, because it no longer wishes to transform that thing into something that is good or something that adheres to a creative harmony, a creative and just harmony. But it participates in something that is static, and hollow to the point where the self becomes a vehicle for more savage motives and disinterested hearts. And so while I find myself sitting here disappointed, I know that there ought to be that ground by which that disappointment may exist, but also the unity brings it to its end. And what do I mean by that? I mean these states of melancholy, the states of passivity, the states of justifying a poor effort, or, perhaps more subtly, an implaced or improperly placed effort. These states can be so subtle and so disarming that they take us for a ride. We go along with it and we don't even know otherwise. And how unfortunate it is when the mind finally snaps back to it and understands that it's been missing something fundamental, something enriching to its soul, And while there's always this balance between, and I suppose it exists at all different levels, between productive labor and that of something that is draining or something that is ruining future potential. I happen to think that much of the worry is self-constructed. That if one were to just push through the uncomfortable feelings, that one need not worry about burnout or of adversity after a while, because it will become second nature to work hard and put forth a strong effort. And it's a matter of belief, I suppose. There are many, and I want to re-emphasize here the importance of the proper place for these efforts, because we all know people that are involved in occupational circumstances that, while the demands that they give to it are high and they give high demand to it, their heart isn't in it, and what experience of life is for them is this constant living against the grain in order to maintain some narrative that they don't really find all that interesting anymore. So let's get back to Parmenides here. I want to try to reinstate or restate some of the image that we've been exposed to so far, or at least as I see it unfolding. We have some fundamental concepts. We have being, we have oneness, we have the one, which is the identity that makes coherent oneness and being. And by this effect, because of the existence of the one, because of, again, those coherent parts, we have the expression of the articulate order that is secondary to its experience. And within this articulate order, we have these questions about, okay, so if the one is responsible for this, if that's the identity of the thing, is the one to be found in all of these sorts of things? And we ask ourselves, well, if one is to be an identity, then how can it be a part of something else? Or we can say, rather, that if itself is maybe found at a foundational level, that it precedes articulate things, or we say the one is as an independent identity, that in and of itself is independent of parts and all of this sort of thing, that it must exist on its own. On one level, we can continue expanding on this sort of thing, but also at another, we've already had this, I think, maybe just the beginnings of, but the exploration of the one, not in terms of this sort of conflicted maintenance of identity and expression of coherence, but rather an identity that's responsible for this maintenance of coherence. And the breaking down of that identity may not be necessary. I may choose to come back and modify those words, but I think if we are to go to this on a more fundamental level, we say, well, what is identity, and just sort of start there again and build our way up. So I want to take some time with this, and I'd like to do it in two ways. The first is going to be through, well, maybe first I should say, I'm going to use Gemini to assist with this definition. So in some sense, it's an internet definition. So we have our basic definition, and then there's going to be more information from different perspectives by which one can see identity. And then I'll ask a follow-up question within the same context window and say, well, what is identity in Platonic terms? And hopefully we won't get too far ahead of our skis in places of Plato that we haven't been yet, or having some of the labor done cheaply and maybe missing some of that productive experience that the exercise prompts us to. But regardless, the etymology is something that is invaluable. So I want to begin with the superficial side of things first. So identity is a multifaceted concept that refers to the qualities, beliefs, personality traits, appearance, or expressions that characterize a person or group. So this is a very poor definition. And I say it's a poor definition because it's obviously a word that is, or a definition that is built on structures that are presupposed that underlie it. Now, what do I mean by that? So, multifaceted concept. So the term itself, in terms of its expression, can appear in different ways. And usually I think, maybe I'm wrong about this, but usually I think that when this is the case, it exists on principles that are quite fundamental, because in the moving away from the source, so to speak, in this ontological landscape, it seems that what is possible is the integration of that principle. And as things move forward, however one would conceptualize moving forward, we can think of time, we can think of I'm not sure really, natural consequences. Farther interactions maybe, farther relations, interrelations. I always hesitate to say complexity, but I could see how there's a possibility by which, or through which, complexity would have a rather interesting and creative interaction with the fundamental principle. But anyway, I say that identity, in the definition that is used here, a modern definition, takes from something that is foundational. Now, equality is something that we've already been through. We've been through a particular process, a process of emanation, of formation. That process is still a bit unclear in my mind, but it's certainly more thought out than it was when I started this. So qualities. These are items that are close to its being. Let's say its particular instantiation. That was the word I was looking for, instantiation, not emanation. I suppose there's a relatedness to emanation too. So quality, in our more formal determination, has been defined as a quality is a kind determination that characterizes what sort of thing an identity is, shaping its character without specifying quantity or momentary state. But the quality is not itself the identity. It's something that participates in it. And so what I said earlier, although I have an inclination towards it about this term having a sort of modern definition but based on more fundamental things, I don't necessarily think that what we're looking for is a more fundamental word. I think what we're thinking about is a more fundamental definition of the word identity. And it's quite strange that the basic modern definition, which I'm considering that comes from a basic Google search of define this word, and then it appears. It's not until later, until you go through the etymology, until you go through the term from different philosophical perspectives, that then it seems like it provides a richer sort of experience, or a richer understanding of the world around us. And again, the interesting thing is that the superficialization of a term, or a term that is its definitions as they move increasingly require some sort of, either it's this sort of passive acceptance or ignorant acceptance, which I would say is the same, passive acceptance, or similar at the very least. I'm trying to find a type of acceptance that is a bit different in nature. Or there's an acceptance on a superficial level, where that level occupies most of the mind, even all of its most productive energies. And so it's restricted to that level. And while there's plenty of interesting opportunities there, the missing of the broader scale and the relations among the axioms, this doesn't occur. And I think that there's something really important lost if the fundamental principles of something get sort of buried, and we take for granted what kind of foundation it provides us, and we can build any number of things on top of it. But anyway, that's not going to get us very far, just talking about the landscape. But it does, I think, clear out some underbrush at the very least. Okay, to stay on this Google definition for a little bit. So multifaceted concepts, the concept that refers to the qualities, which we have defined as something that gives a distinction, a type of organizational distinction to an identity. But the quality is not the identity of it itself. Now, when I say that, there is an implication that the organization comes from the subject. It can be shared. I think there can be a formal system by which kinds are reasonably classified, but still, a classification is a system that exists within that subjective experience. And I'm not making an argument about truth or falsehood. I'm worried that if we misdefine this word quality, then we miss out on a type of seeing that is sort of like the scaffolding by which we manage the definition of identity. So since the word character is mentioned in this, if we have our shorter definition, quality describes the character of a thing, what kind it is, rather than how it appears at a given moment. So next I'd like to define kind and then also character. So the definition of kind is the intelligible classification that answers what sort of thing something is, in virtue of its essential mode of being. So by intelligible, we know that it's articulate. We know that the principles that afford thingness, we have the being and oneness, we have the one, and its interplay. Kind is the intelligible classification that answers what sort of thing something is. Now, thingness is quite easy, or maybe quite simple. Sometimes the simple is not easy to think about, but it's quite easy, or okay, again, simple, to think about being as itself, or thingness as itself, because by itself it's undifferentiated. We don't get lost in the confusion of potential for which things can be. When we think about thing, we think about something that is, just sort of an unknown figure in the mind for now. A stable principle, a universal principle. We could make any sort of symbol in the mind for it. We could just draw a circle and say, this is it. This is the thing. Whatever it happens to be, its dimensions don't matter. So it answers what type of thing or what type of being a thing is. It is stable across instances, which I think is approaching our identity definition. So what does it mean to be stable across instances? Stability, I think, implies a mirroring of that particular type of thingness. That mirroring is something that maintains its angle, its sort of angle of attack for existence, so to speak. It's like my identity, for example. It's always a pleasure to meet people that are stable, coherent, directed consistently in one direction, that they are dependable. And for whatever reason, I think about this as a type of stability. It's a type of stability of identity, of course. In the human being, it's nice to know people that are rock solid, that are unmoving, assuming that they have good values, a good orientation. And further, I think it's useful to reflect on the conscious experience, the self-aware experience, this unimaginable light cone of experience that is not inanimate, that can reflect on its own light, let's say. That this thing, despite its awareness and potential for change, has the capacity to stay a stable identity. Now, in our experience, of course, there are plenty of narratives that can be addressed here, not just the positive one that I mentioned. And I think the comforting, but perhaps also discomforting aspect of things, it's not just the material, but also the immaterial that are subject to the existence of difference and its relation when it meets the coherence of being in oneness. Or maybe I should say, as the coherence of being one and oneness expresses itself. Because within the coherence, I think there's implied difference. And so it wouldn't be the other way around. It wouldn't make any sense to have it like a separate force. I picture this sort of unfolding, not necessarily a fountain, almost like a blooming flower that folds back in on itself, and it continually blooms in this sort of steady state. Perhaps there's multiple colors around it, kind of a strange image, but it's an interesting reality that we find ourselves in. But going back to kind, we said it's stable across instances. It is not perceptual, though it is recognized through perception. Not really sure what to do with that, or if that's necessarily needed at this point. Well, I think it does bring up an interesting idea, I guess, because earlier I had mentioned that this aspect of the subject is relevant in a certain way. It's relevant in the way that we wonder how, looking through the prism or the angle of our expression through our experience, what does this limit us to? We're only exposed to so much information. We're only capable of handling so much of it. We're synthesizing it correctly establishing the appropriate weights to things and how appropriate they are related to each other. Now, on the other side of this, we have the word character. How that kind is internally configured. Character is the structured pattern of qualities that gives a particular identity its distinctive way of being within its kind. So what we are seeing here is a nested relationship. And there's a number of questions that come up of the identity at the fundamental layer. Since we're going through things, it seems like we're going through that process of differentiation. As it separates from that fundamental source, and as the angle appears more evident by which it's expressed among all of the other things that are expressed. We have this linguistic system by which we are trying to identify these places in what, in other terms, I may not be able to conjure up, but for now, at least in terms of I want to say place, but no, place is not the right word. In terms of progression, and progression still I think there's an issue with. So I'm imagining almost like a cosmic expansion situation from a single source. We have this abundance of differentiation. abundance of things that can move back into a type of unity. I may be moving myself into a territory which I'm imagining a bunch of things but not explaining it well. For that, I apologize. But what I think now is of this sort of nested doll situation, or of the cosmic expansion situation. The grand expansion from that fundamental place can be seen in many different places. It doesn't mean that they're all happening to the same degree or to the same scale, but the pattern of differentiation, the existence of that angularity, the popular angularity, I'll say, and then some reintegration into something that is still has difference, but also is something that is new, and a new identity, a new thing that's stable over time. We've described one sort of slice of it, which is what type of being is represented by this angular expression. And then we say, well, again, I want to give a little bit more, fill this out a little bit. The type of thing, again, stability, it's a precondition. A pattern that is in nature that can be perceived by those that perceive things. But it's not necessary for it itself to be a perceptual agent. And it serves as a ground. It grounds what's even more multiplicitous and divergent into that coherent identity. And again, it seems like another iteration of the process that the lower level, the typeness, had occurred from the source of the coherence between oneness and being. Now at this level, at the level of kind, it's not just a matter of being a base of potential experience that we have with the one. That is the fundamental principle of oneness and being together. We're at a step above now. How that can be integrated into something that is not something else. The field that's established, again, thinking about this cone of expansion from that center point, and now we're a bit wider, we're a bit farther out. We have a field in between the zone of the kind and what we will call later as maybe the zone of the characteristic. So in the zone of the kind, we have the answers to the questions, what can this thing reasonably do? What kinds of qualities can belong to it? What would count as corruption or fulfillment? And so we have to think about this, because I think that there are plenty of situations that we can find ourselves in where the word kind may be disputed somehow, that the place of this word is somewhere else. But I want to make sure, regardless of whatever word that we might use, that the word kind that we're using now is used to describe this particular section. And so motion is important. We've established that it's coming off of a central source at a particular angle. Its angular expression affords certain capacities. is able to do certain things. What's interesting, though, is that we have this set before characteristic or property takes hold. And for a while I had trouble with this. I still have trouble with it, but it's becoming a little bit more clear. And it could still be a mistake. Maybe we have to think about something here in a little bit more detail. But there's a coherence in the following manner. That when we think about something that is, there's a thought. I think it's an axiom. We would consider it an axiom. That the identity of something is not restricted to its material components. But because it's not restricted to it, doesn't mean that there are two separate realities, so to speak. They participate together. They are woven together. But within the weaving of something, we have parts that can be identified. I think this experience is like a never-ending thing of thinking about unification and multiplicity and all of this. But moving on to character, we have how that kind is internally configured. Character is the structured pattern of qualities that gives a particular identity its distinctive way of being within its kind. So, perhaps our image needs some modification. Maybe we can keep on one hand this cosmic progression image. It's useful, but I don't think it describes the subtlety of what we are exploring here. If we are to take it, that character is to be defined in this way. There's a truth in the sense of the progression, which our original image maintains. But given the definition, character is the structured pattern of qualities. So this is more like an organizational principle. Now, that's not to say that kind is not also an organizational principle, but it's an organizational filter, maybe I should say. I think we can also say it's a principle. Maybe the principle is the filter. So it's a structured pattern of qualities that gives a particular identity its distinctive way of being within its kind. Okay. So today happens to be a new day, and like always, a new day brings new thoughts. And I'm satisfied with where this is going so far, and so I want to continue in that vein. So just to recreate the image from yesterday for my own sake, what I'm envisioning is a dynamic process. Dynamic in one sense that it is unfolding, but dynamic in the other sense, in the sense that this image is constantly changing. We're getting ourselves into a structured relationship between the one, kind, characteristic, quality, identity, intelligibility, all of this. These fundamental concepts that we've almost explored them to a nauseating degree, they still remain these elusive concepts in some sense because they're so fundamental. But nonetheless, here we are. And so we have the one, and from the one's coherence, we have the expression of difference into being in oneness. And by this expression, we have all of these angular interpretations of being. right down to the candle that is lit in front of me, to my own heart's desires. All of these are angular expressions. Even the falsehood of my thoughts. It's an angular expression of being. Now from the one, and as I've said, the coherence there and the expression, or the expression of it and the influence of difference within that coherence, and the angular expression of articulate things, we are starting to build structure around that. And the structure defines the angle, and I think it also defines so let me be careful with my language. So if we say by kind that this classification answers what sort of thing something is, in virtue of its essential mode of being, would we say that this is the angle? Maybe we wouldn't go that far, because the angle is as the angle is. The kind is the way in which we describe the angle. Now, I think this needs some farther fleshing out. I think a lot of this is not so much the angle by which it expresses, but rather for our observations is more importantly the question of what can the thing do based on the angle that it's expressed at. I'll come back to this because perhaps there's a way in which we can integrate this idea of the angle and the expression of that off of the coherence of oneness and being that might be useful. So we go to character. We say character is a structured pattern of qualities that gives a particular identity its distinctive way of being within its kind. So there's often the expression, you're being a particular way. And in this context, I think it's an interesting thing to think about. For there are plenty of these different mood states that we have, and dispositions. And by those states that we are in, we could be agitated, we could be joyful, etc. By these states, we assume we take on sort of an angle of the type, if that makes sense. It's an angle of the kind. It's an iterated expression off of the particular type of coherence between oneness and being. And so, again, the character, we can say much like kind, is not an angle per se, but it's that distinction, perhaps the linguistic distinction by which the usefulness of the angle is expressed or identified. My apologies for all of the weird sounds, but my cat is having a difficulty getting himself adjusted, so I opened up the blinds, so hopefully he will look out the window instead of make a fuss. So, going off of this way of approaching it, we think about our character, the structured pattern of these qualities. That gives a particular identity its distinctive way of being within its kind. It answers, what is this thing like? So there's the relational component. If something is to be like something else, we have these components, identity components, stable across time. That's why there is this sort of shared expression. But they are not the identity themselves in question. It's something that's more specific than kind. But more stable than properties, because properties are sort of state characteristics. Like if something is hard, if it's soft, what color it is. More superficial distinctions as opposed to some others. It shapes how identity coheres and expresses itself over time. So I'm thinking in this way that these qualities are sort of parts of the identity. They themselves are not the thing, but they do shape coherence. And these are not arbitrary, they're not momentary. So character would be, an example would be a gentle person, a refined design, a robust constitution, a harmonious system. And of each of these, if we took a person, a design, a constitution, a system, we could say any sort of adjective along with that to describe that thing. But I'm not quite sure adjective would be the right description here. After looking at its definition, the way that I am, it would take me forever on that to come to a conclusion, but let's move on. The point being is that there is some description over a more fundamental type of something. So character is not a single quality. It's the configuration of the qualities together. An equality is a non-qualitative determination that shapes the character of an identity and is appropriate to its kind. So again, the kind determines what sort of thing it is. The qualities determine what sort of character it has. The character is a coherent pattern of those qualities. quality, again, is a non-quantitative determination that shapes the character of an identity and is appropriate to its kind. And the properties are those momentary, instanced features. So we have this flow from kind to qualities to character to instantiation to properties. Now what's interesting here is this idea of determination. Because on one hand we have this expression of a particular thing, of what sort it is. But the qualities don't determine the kind of thing it is. It determines the character. The character is downstream of the kind. And so that leaves us in an interesting place of reflection, because we have to consider what an identity is prior to determination. And the farther question is it possible to have an identity that's prior to determination? Or we can pose the question in another way. Perhaps it has nothing to do with the absolute sense that kind is prior to determination, but rather that a quality is only just a particular type of determination. Because a determination is something that is identifiable, I think. It's something that can be pointed to. And even before the kind, we have oneness in being. They're determinate states of the one. And in fact, this procedure, in a bizarre way, applies to the one as much as it applies to anything that's within this room, the book that I'm reading. So it is the case that determination can be before the quality. So I suppose now the question then becomes of determination. Of the types of determinants that are before qualities, I have to wonder, in the first instance, about the stability of these things, because it would seem that as we move out into things that are more and more differentiated, that although we have this capacity for an abundance of identities, we also have a potential, I'm not sure if this is a true pattern or not, a potential for the reduction in the permanence of a particular identity. And I say that because when we have things that share all of these properties, when we have a creative agent, let's say, that produces all of these material goods for all of these different purposes, they are not as stable as the principles that underlie them, of course. We ourselves are not very stable, just from a perspective of time. Our particular instantiation does not last long. But I think that there's a relationship here. On one hand, there is the thought that an identity may be lost when the qualities are insufficiently bound to maintain any sort of character specific to that thing. But all the same, we do have the angular expression by which something comes to be. We have the kind. We have the type of thing that it is. And I am so accustomed to think about the characteristics of something as being the whole explanation. But if we are to imagine a stage, what we might call a pre-qualitative stage, we have a structural differentiation, where we think not so much about features and more about position, as we would in any sort of structural illustration. So here we don't have roundness, we don't have redness, we don't have fragility. We have this, we have not this, we have inside, we have outside, we have sameness, we have otherness. And out of these structural themes, we're still at a place, I think, where differentiation has begun. Of course it has begun. It's from the initial get-go, but differentiation is in full force, so to speak. It is moving into that possibility. But in the structural state, within the state of kind, if I can say such a thing, I have to wonder if the type can be determined by an inside-outside, a same and other, this not this distinction. These are quite fundamental. And this is a distinction between identities that are different. But it doesn't seem to fulfill the requirement of type. So in some sense, I think we have to describe again where we have been. So we have the one, which we've been playing with this idea of an expression or an identity that is not necessarily a pure unity, but there's nothing really before it, so to speak. There's a degree of articulation in the sense that we have two parts, two components. We have that which is being and that which is one. And we could say that difference has its first expression here. But at the same time, there's a unique relationship. It's hard to say that difference participates in the same way as it does in things of a greater articulate nature, let's say, or a less fundamental nature. Now, this is the territory I think that we need to flesh out in more detail. For we have this bridge of coherence. This coherence explains to us what the relationship is between oneness and being and how it proceeds. Now there is that potential danger by which, if we think about something, especially something in the beginning, we think about that which is, or the one, and oneness. there's a type of purity that exists here that is not articulate in the full expression, that the articulate pieces that we may identify, oneness and being, they have yet to move in a particular direction. Now the question is, well, what direction must they necessarily move in if we are going to have something other than just this conceptual experience of the one, for which oneness and being are its parts? So let's imagine a landscape. In some sense, it's a landscape of nothing to begin with, but it's not necessarily no thing. It's just potential and something that is not yet differentiated. Now, in my mind, I think about almost like this outer space, in which there's this vast blackness, for which we would say that nothing is there. And nothing, of course, being in our immediate vicinity. And let's just say we can't really see any stars or anything visible in this landscape. There's a way in which I don't think we should stay within the landscape of nothing, because we are not trying to produce something from nothing. It doesn't make any sense to say something like that. We have something. And instead of getting lost in the analogy like we're moving out into nothingness, rather, I think we have to view it as an occupation of potential, an expression of oneness and being through difference, through variation. We have identity, of course, we have some stability across moments, across time. So in the realm of type, in the realm of kind, we have this. In the first instance, I want to think about a linear progression, just for a moment. I'm not sure how useful the image is in totality, but for right now, I think I need to use it. So what do I mean by this? So we start with our fundamental source. We start with our two principles, connected by this coherence, the bridge of coherence, and expressed. So we have these principles, oneness and being. They're always together. And then we have difference. And at the first instance, I have to wonder, what is the split? We could say, well, the first split is oneness and being, and yet there's a unity there, and the unity defies the split in some way. Okay, so we have a bit of mythical language there. But this is not where we are conceptually, where we want to be conceptually. We're asking ourselves the question, the first instance. And I suppose the first instance would be the identification of this versus that, this or not this. And it's hard to conceptualize because, well, what would we say that this thing is and that thing is not without these qualities? Now, the kind is meant to ground those qualities. So my mind drifts towards some sort of presupposition, potentially. Whereas the not this component would have certain constraints, but the constraints aren't defined as rigidly as we would be able to explicitly identify the qualities or its character yet. So let's take an example, or at least let's try to take an example. Something that's very differentiated. So the first thing that comes to mind is the human being. The human being as it develops in the womb. Of course, this thing, this identity, has no physical resemblance to what the mature human being will look like, nor does it share very many qualities with the adult human being. Now, there are some shared, of course. But even though we are thinking about things at this level, at this plane, I wonder what the fundamental aspects of this relationship are. On one hand, we have the progression of this thing into something else, a transformation of one identity to another. And yet, in very fundamental ways, this identity is changing. In very fundamental ways, it is staying the same. For the genetic makeup, genetic composition, it is the same. It may be expressed different in time, and that difference would lead to differing characteristics based on the qualities that are present. But on the other hand, it is quite clear that the thing that is in the developing fetus sense its kind, let's say, affords these qualities to be, I suppose. And just like in the case of the fetus, the adult human being does the same. It affords a particular expression of qualities that then are coherently expressed as the character of the thing. And then on top of this, we have our properties. And so while in the same light, we have two separate identities that have quite intricate boundaries. And the boundaries here are not necessarily just like a wall around the thing, though it can be conceptualized that temporarily. In a more sophisticated sense, we've used this image before, but it's more like the light cones or the pillars of light that have this fuzzy, but also at the same time, especially when zoomed out or when compared to something else, there is difference. And even though there's subtle overlap between these things, the difference in the identity of the thing is maintained. There's a certain concentration of the light cones, and in these sort of approximate ways, such that something is and is to itself. And so if we say it like this, that the light cones can be themselves differentiated into different concentrations, maybe, I have to imagine a light cone that is basic in a sense. Maybe there's just one of these light cones, and then there's a light of another color. Now even here we have we've sort of started superficially. We're giving these things properties instead of something more fundamental like a quality, which I think is an interesting place to start. But within this realm of what we would call the pre-qualitative stage, it does seem to be simple, much like properties are simple on the other end of it. Because again, at this level, we're thinking about this and not this, inside versus outside, and same versus other. And so while our analogy doesn't 100% line up, it at least gives us some familiar image by which we can represent this experience. So, however, if we are going to stay with this light cone analogy, as difference is something that is carving out these sections, carving out real estate, so to speak, for identities within the expression, the coherence of the one. We do have something that is and something that not is. And in the first fissure, the first barrier, the first boundary that is made, the question is it the simple fact that we are choosing to say that there is something and there is not something? There is something of this and not something of this. And here, the desire is to say, well, what is it about this that makes it different from not this? And at the base level, I don't think it can go any more than that. But again, the sophistication of grammar, I think, needs an update. We need greater language to describe this liminal space of identity. So I think we've established at least the first part of this grammar, which is distinction. It's not a difference of features, but it's this cut, this fissure. It is this and not this. It is same and other. Nothing yet is within it. It's only separation. And just like we can say that there is being and oneness without saying what the being is or what the thing that is unified is, we still, I think, conceptually understand that because of all the examples that are out there in the world. The second one I think we've also identified, if not explicitly, it's implied, and that is boundary or some limit. And by this boundary, by the limit, we have something that stabilizes the thing. Stabilizes the thing relative to that which is not, something else. So we have something that is here, and then something that is beyond it, beyond itself. In the next instance, we have what we might call position. It is a position within the field of otherness. And I have to wonder, maybe a field of otherness is not necessarily... Well, it's a field of otherness in a particular sense. It's not a field of difference per se, it's a field of otherness. Otherness implying otherness and being in oneness in various angles of otherness. But still not yet articulated. Still not yet, well, it's articulated to a degree, but not articulated in the way that we experience things to be articulated. The other, which is part of the fundamental definition of identity, is this persistence. The boundary has to hold. The distinction doesn't collapse immediately. That when there is this cut that is made, that thing that is separated from the other thing is something that continues. So we have here the birth of identity. The birth, as it may be described, is in embryo. Now from here it seems like there's a difficult step to take. Because we have this, we have not that. We have the beginning of our identity through persistence. Position, boundary, distinction, all of these are immediately formed together. But now that we have this, now that we have two things that are persistent, we sort of wonder now, what are these things holding? Or maybe that's not the right question to ask. We can ask, how are they related to each other? So today happens to be a new day. And before we round out this episode, I'd like to finish the thought from yesterday. And one thought that comes to mind when reading, or rather listening to where I was yesterday, is out of all of the things that are, I find it difficult to separate myself away from. Perhaps it's impossible to do so, I'm not sure yet. But I find myself difficult to separate myself away from linearity. And while earlier I said linearity is going to be necessary for now, just to conceptualize, there's a part of me that wonders, and perhaps believes, that this linearity is insufficient to solve the issue that we are working on here. And I mean that in the following way. Because I imagine something that has some source, what flows from it is this gradual procession of differentiation and uniqueness. And the question that I have in my mind is there a direct correlate between uniqueness and differentiation? And I suppose we could say yes on some level, because as things take on differing properties by which we identify some stable character, they become less about something that is not definite and something that is more definite, let's say. And here I sort of run into the same problem of yesterday that was solved. But the problem approaching something that is not definite, indefinite, perhaps we would say, is that it doesn't participate in the character of things that we know and participate with. And that if we are to attribute a grammar to something that is pre-distinctive, the identity becomes so seemingly intermixed at a higher level that one must wonder, at what point do we make the change from the indefinite to the definite? Now, earlier, I brought up this idea of determination without description. And although it may be unsatisfying to explore a concept and not be able to go really much farther, I think it's necessary to a degree. The fartherness, the progression that we are going to have here is going to be in defining these grammatical maybe grammatical light cones. I'm not really sure what we would call them. At a certain level, when we ask ourselves what makes this different from that, there is no answer other than that is different from that. Or this is different from that, whatever we want to say. And the this and that these are almost hollow terms. They're not hollow in the sense that they describe something, but the something is without description. But it is still determinate. It is still something. And yesterday the analogy was that just as we've been thinking about being in oneness, and it's been easy to conceptualize being in oneness even as principles, I think we must also think about determination without description. And to say farther, that being in oneness just by themselves, well, we say being, we understand that there is something. It doesn't really matter. The concept for being is enough. And then oneness, we have the unification of being into some one thing. So let's build our landscape up again and see where we can take it. So yesterday I mentioned that within our grammar of the pre-description is distinction. So we have the this and that situation, the same or other. We have our boundary, which describes limits. We have a position of a thing. We have the birthplace of identity through persistence. And what we were approaching was relation. Now let's try a top-down view of relation. I'll take myself. I'll take my relations to other things. And actually, on the top of my mind right now, sort of a bizarre experience. I saw my cat sitting by the edge of my chair a moment ago. I'm not really sure where he went, but I have this feeling that he is underneath me, that he's sitting underneath my chair. Now, why does this matter? Well, in a sense, there's a particular type of relation that is happening here. Not a particularly sophisticated relationship. The fact that I'm not really sure if he is actually under there, but all the same, there is an approximate relationship between myself and the cat. And there's an extended relationship by which we share social connection. I understand certain communicative behaviors through the face, through the body language, and he also understands a degree of mine. And by this, we are able to communicate, we are able to relate. And there's all sorts of levels of these relating type scenarios. I'm relating to my chair right now in terms of my physical approximation to it. My legs are resting on the coffee table, another type of relating. But these are all very complicated types of relations. For when we speak of something that is without description, I can't be in the equation for that. But in essence, when we describe a relation, we're describing some participation. Now, the interesting thing is that while my mind is apt to go towards physical as something of a participation, it doesn't have to be. And so we imagine this landscape of potential relations. And I ask the question, what are some fundamental components of relation? Well, I suppose distance is one. I could be close or I could be far from something. I could be inside of something, or something could be inside of me. So, for example, my cat, he's in my mind, he is in my thoughts. So there's a way in which I'm relating to the cat. Now, the definition of relation has something to do with carrying information, connecting one point to another. From the Latin roots, we have the noun relatio, or relationem, meaning a bringing back, a restoring, a report. So we have the prefix, which is re, meaning back or again. And then the suffix, we have a word meaning to carry or to bear. Not to bring back, to bear again. In the Old French, we have the meaning meant to report or account, to carry back news. In Middle English, we have the initial meaning of relationship or connection or correspondence. By the late 14th century, it meant the act of telling or relating in words. We have an idea of kinship around 1500, describing a person related by blood. So it's almost as if we have to expand the word more so than anything. But let's take elements from the root and elements from its definition, the original definition, in which we're thinking about information being connected between 2 points. Now, the idea of carrying back information, or to bear information again, is kind of interesting, because there implies almost like an implicit memory of a fundamental type of orientation. And I think this sort of gets to the heart of what we're talking about. The first one that I mentioned, this near or farther situation, is one of those fundamental types of relating. If I return to a type of relationship, I'm potentially returning to being closer or farther from something. Now, there are other types, because of course this doesn't encompass the gamut, the entirety of the whole. And I suppose, again, it's worthwhile mentioning that the whole here, again, is information connecting. Within connection, perhaps maybe that's another interesting word to explore. Within connection, we have all of these variabilities, different ways of doing it. So I also mentioned the inside and the outside. In the case with myself and the cat, it can be fairly sophisticated. I'm looking at him now, he's in my thoughts. It's within me in some way. In fact, he's getting a little excited because I looked at him and he may jump on my lap at any moment, so I have to be ready for that. But inside and outside brings up ideas of parts and whole and intrinsic and extrinsic, foreign and common. And I think from these types of relating, well, it seems obvious that, especially in the example of inside and outside, there are more subtle ways in which we represent relating. And by the subtlety of relating as it increases or changes, expands, influenced by difference, I think there's different ways that we can go about describing this. What begins to become clearer are the conditions for properties to come about. But we're not quite there yet, so we can't get ahead of ourselves. Another potential way of relating is maybe a concept of agreeing or disagreeing, or something that is aligned or something that is opposed. Now, I think I'm going to end this episode here, so we don't get too far into it. And starting again anew back with the text, I think is going to be productive, given some of the territory that we've explored. So until next time.